All right, guys, let's get to our notes and let's pick up right where we left off. So this is a little section. Let me present. So you should already have this title. We're going to pick up right where we left off. So there's no need to write this title again. This is just my intro slide into our notes here. But if we took a little section of this person's back here, like a little square punch right out of this kid's back, if we were to take that and then we were to put it on a dissecting microscope so that we could see all of these structures, if we went down maybe like a millimeter into the skin, we would see this. And we would see all these hair follicles coming down. We would see sweat glands. We would see blood vessels. Please don't try this at home. We would see fat tissue underneath. You'd see probably some muscle here. I remember adipose tissue here. And then we would have this epidermis layer at the top. And the epidermis layer is where the skin is constantly growing. And so we're going to first focus on the epidermis layer. And we talked on Tuesday about the very bottom layer of the epidermis. So this layer right here is known as the stratum germinativum. And I think that's where we left off. Kim's asking about what happens to our skin when we get tattooed. Hold that question because I'm going to show you some slides of tattoos under the microscope to see exactly what it looks like when the ink goes in and where it goes. So we'll come back to that. But basically, to answer your question, when you get a tattoo, the needle is going through the epidermis into the dermis here. And it's depositing ink in the dermis. And since the dermis does not replace, it's not constantly renewing, once the ink is in there, it's permanent. If the ink only went down to the epidermis layer here, then it wouldn't be permanent. Because you're constantly making new cells, and those cells are constantly pushing their way up, pushing their way up, pushing their way up. So in order for a tattoo to be permanent, the needle has to go down into the dermis all the way through the epidermis. And that's why the needle goes like into the skin. And that's why it's, you have to make sure that your tattoo artist is sterilizing their needles because there's a lot of blood vessels in the dermis. And as it goes through, it's breaking blood vessels. The blood vessels will heal, but since you're breaking blood vessels, because you're going in deep, you don't want to get a tattoo after somebody else has got a tattoo, because then you can get bloodborne diseases like HIV or hepatitis, stuff like that. Does it kill any cells or vessels? Yeah, it kills them, but then they come back. They repair themselves. I mean, as your teacher, legally, I'm going to say you're not supposed to have tattoos if you're under 18, and the person who gave you that tattoo technically broke the law because they're not supposed to. My brother-in-law actually is a tattoo artist. He does private, tattoos and stuff, and he's explained how bad it is for people to give underage people tattoos. You lose your license basically. And he's put a lot of time and energy into keeping that license. But basically, okay, so Kim's asking, so basically just make sure that's a good place. Well, yes, so you're supposed to be over 18 for anybody to tattoo you legally. And it's really important that whoever is tattooing you sterilizes their kit really well. And if they have a license, they're supposed to be sterilizing it to a certain standard. That's why there's a license. And just remember, guys, tattoos are permanent. They're going into the dermis. You can't get them out. The only way that you can get rid of them is by burning the dermis with a laser, which is expensive and a little painful. It's the only way to get that tattoo out. All right, so make sure it's something on your body that you want there for the rest of your life. And one of the reasons why it's illegal to tattoo somebody under 18 is because we know that your brains are still developing and you may not know really what you want on your body for the rest of your life. And so it's always a good idea to give it some time. Think through what you're going to have tattooed there. They do fade. They fade as you get older because the proteins in your dermis become they don't regenerate themselves as well. Usually they just fade, but if you've ever seen an older person with a tattoo, the lines aren't as clear. It's because the ink starts to fade on these protein fibers, this fibrin and collagen here. We'll spend a lot of time on tattoos though, so my bad, I shouldn't get into it so much. So I'll answer all these questions, and I'm sure there'll be more too when we get to it. Okay. The outer layer of the epidermis is known as the stratum corneum. Now, this is the part of my skin that you're looking at. You're looking at my stratum corneum. Stratum corneum. You can't see the stratum germinativum because it's underneath the stratum corneum. This layer of skin is dead. And in fact, if I do this to my hand, those dead cells fall off. And if you do that enough to your hand, more dead cells fall off. That's dust. If you're ever walking around your house and you're wondering why is there dust on everything, it's because you and your family members are constantly dropping stratum corneum cells. They're dead and they're covered in this protein that makes them nice and tough and waterproof. So they're the top layers. You should be writing notes now, by the way. Let's pick up right where we left off. This is the top layers of our skin. They are squamous cells, so they're flat. It's one of the reasons why, if you take some dust, I actually have some on my keyboard after I did that, and you look at it, it looks really flat. Little flat white little flakes, almost like dandruff, because that's what dandruff is. Dandruff is stratum corneum cells that have fallen off the scalp. These cells are dead on the outside of our skin. They die as they move from the lower layers of the epidermis. So now if we look here, this here is the stratum germinativum. There's the text. Why is this not working? Oh, there we go. Okay. This is the stratum corneum. And stratum just means layer in Latin. The cells begin their life at the stratum germinativum, and they slowly move their way up, 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 to become stratum corneum cells over time. It takes about 2 weeks for the cells to begin their life and then eventually fall off. So it takes about a week for them to become stratum corneum cells, for them to die, and then to become covered in keratin. And so we say that they are keratinized cells. And now, what is keratin? It's this tough, water-resistant protein. And it's found covering the outer cells of our skin. It's also the same material that makes up our hair. So you can imagine the same material that makes up our hair is the same material that makes up these outer layers of our skin. They're waterproof to a point. I mean, you can definitely put enough water on them that they no longer can keep the water out. And then your nails. are a really hardened version of keratinized cells. This is basically just keratin, is what a nail is. So your skin has the same material as your fingernails, just a little bit less. And so what this does is it creates a tough outer layer for our skin. It also allows waterproofing, so that if we get water on our skin, the water doesn't go into the lower layers of our cells and you know, make them separate or get bigger. Now, if you've ever been in the pool for an hour or two, or if you've ever been in a bath for a long time, you'll notice that your fingertips and your toes start to kind of wrinkle a little bit. You start to prune a little bit. That's because this keratin, these keratinized cells, they are waterproof, but they're not perfectly waterproof. And given enough time and enough water, that water will get into your epidermis and it causes the epidermis to puff. Now, if you stayed in a bath, they would just keep puffing up and your fingers would get super wrinkly, your toes would get super wrinkly, and eventually they would start to fall apart. The skin would start to pull apart. And so we don't want that to happen by just putting your hand in water. So that keratin just kind of slows the process. It waterproofs us a little bit. And if you don't believe me that you're waterproof, the next time you take a shower, just don't grab your towel and just look at the water on your body. And you'll notice that the water beads up, creates little water drops. That's what happens when something's waterproof. It causes the water to bead up. And that's why we take towels and we wipe off those water beads, and doesn't get soaked into our body when we shower too much. But this is the stratum corneum, the outer layer of our cell. That's stratum corneum. Down here is the stratum germinativum. And there's other layers here. We're not going to learn about all the other layers, but just know that the cells start here and they slowly migrate as they get older to become these dead keratinized cells, and then eventually they just fall off. We say slough off. Anybody know what we're looking at? What's happened to this person's head? What is that condition called?
Is that dandruff?
Yeah, Veronica, exactly. It's dandruff. I heard there's like a Spanish word for it. What is the Spanish word for it?
Caspa.
Caspa. That's right. Somebody brought that up in 5th period. See, I learned something from you guys sometimes. Thank you, Gloria. Caspa. So this is clumps of stratum corneum cells that are coming off because the scalp is too dry. Now, normally our skin produces oils to stop this from happening, but in some individuals, they may not be producing enough oil so that the scalp gets really dry. And sometimes it can be caused by a fungus that's growing in the scalp. And that's why you get like a shampoo like Head and Shoulders, which kills some of the fungus so that your body can, your scalp can stay nice and moist. So the stratum corneum doesn't fall off all over the place. And if you've ever seen this on somebody who has a bad case, sometimes the flakes fall on their shirt and stuff. If they're wearing like black clothes, it doesn't look all that great. But it's just dead hair cells, or scalp cells. What are we looking at here?
Blisters?
Yeah, right, Veronica, blisters. This is the stratum corneum responding to abrasion, responding to something, some type of friction against the hand. If you've ever worked out or been a gymnast or played baseball where you have to grab something for a long time, or any type of sport where you got to grab stuff, your hands, particularly that outer layer, the stratum corneum, will try to build itself thicker so that damage underneath doesn't keep happening. So damage to the stratum germinativum stops, because we don't want to damage the place where we're making new skin cells. So what the body does when there's repeated damage over and over again is it creates a thick layer of stratum corneum. It will actually create areas of your hand that have more skin cells than others. And we call that a blister. The only way to get rid of blisters is to stop causing damage to the hands. If you work out, or if you lift weights, or if you play a sport that requires you to grab stuff, you probably have blisters on your hands where you're constantly grabbing things. I know I used to work out a lot. I don't anymore. I used to have blisters all around here, all here. But then when I stopped, give it a couple weeks, because remember, skin replaces itself in a couple weeks, your hands get nice and smooth again. So this isn't permanent, of course. This is just your body's response to repeated stress. It's actually a good thing that it happens because it protects the skin underneath. It protects the lower layer of the epidermis underneath, or like the monkey bars, exactly this. That's a good question, Gloria. Yeah, this is one of the body's defense mechanisms, really. Sometimes the abrasion is so bad that it creates a pocket of fluid, and we call that a blister. You can see that there may be a little bit of a blister forming there. And that's, again, a response, an inflammation response, inflammatory response to repeated damage to the stratum germinativum layers of the epidermis. And so the outer layer of the stratum corneum basically gets thicker and thicker. And there's actually thicker parts of skin than other. If you noticed your hands, the palms of your hands look different than the tops of your hands. And in fact, if you take your fingers and you rub the hand like this, then you take your fingers and you rub the other side like that, you can almost feel the difference in thickness. We have the thickest layers of stratum corneum on our hands and on our feet. So that things we grab, we have a little bit more protection. And then where we have to walk, we have a little bit more protection. So that's a good question, Will. So it's more sensitive because we have brain structures that have more, there's more control in the brain. And when we talk about the brain and the nervous system, I'll show you what I mean. There's more areas of the brain that are responsible for sensing things in our hands and our feet. Evolutionarily speaking, having more sensitivity in the hands and feet would be a benefit because let's say we're jumping from tree to tree. Our ancient ancestors needed to jump from tree to tree. They needed to grab things. They needed to know what they're grabbing when they're jumping on something quickly. Or even just think about us as humans. We grab things with our hands. So we want our hands to be more sensitive, to have more areas in the brain processing all of that information than we would need here. There's also more nerve receptors in the fingers and hands and the feet, which allows the brain to process more information. So there's actually two reasons why we have more sensitivity in our hands and feet, even though we have thicker skin there. How do you get calluses? So a callus basically is just a repeated blister like this over and over again. It's just extra stratum corneum. Underneath the epidermis, bottom layer of the epidermis, that stratum germinativum. Let me see if there's a slide here. Yeah, the stratum germinativum right here, it just goes into overdrive to create more cells, and it pushes more cells up, 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 and so we have a thicker layer of stratum corneum where we need it. Does that make sense, Kim? So these cells are constantly moving slowly up, up, up. And if we have an area that's getting damaged because of pressure pushing down on it like that, more cells will come up to rescue to create a little bit more padding there. So here's a diagram of the epidermis. You can see the stratum germinativum at the bottom here, and you can see the stratum corneum up at the top. You can see there's other names for all these layers. All I want you to be aware of is that the cells start here. So this is start. and then eventually they move as time elapses. So one cell gets created, it pushes its way up. As another cell gets created, it gets pushed up even further. As another cell gets created, it gets pushed up even further. And they move from one stratum to the next. When they get to this stratum right here, which is called the stratum granulosum, they start to die. And you can see the cells changing color. They start to die, and they start to become keratinized, and they flatten. And as they die, they become keratinized, covered in keratin, and flatten. They then become like flakes. And then those flakes eventually flake off and are replaced by newer cells underneath. And like I said, that happens about every 2 weeks. So every 2 weeks, you get a whole new layer of skin. It's pretty cool if you think about it. Every 2 weeks, you're making a whole brand new layer of skin, outer epidermal layer of skin. Now, there's something else that's happening, and it's happening with these funky shaped cells right here. I don't want to try to draw that. These cells are called melanocytes. And the melanocyte looks a little bit different than the other cells because they can produce a pigment, a coloring, when needed. And in fact, the melanocyte is a cell that's found in the stratum germinativum that's responsible for giving color to our skin. Those of us that have lighter skin have less melanocytes in our epidermis. Those of us that have darker skin have more melanocytes in their epidermis. And these melanocytes can produce different pigments. Some are darker than others. So if somebody was really, really dark skinned, like somebody who came from the continent of Africa, they would have really dark skin because they have lots of melanocytes in their epidermis, much more so than me. And those melanocytes make a very dark brown pigment, which causes their skin to look dark brown. Depending on the amount of melanocytes you have, these guys right here, and the pigment that they produce determines what skin color you have. This is what melanocytes look like under the microscope. And you can actually see the coloring that they create. So this has been stained, so it has more of a black appearance than it actually does. This is a diagram of a melanocyte down here. You can see the melanocytes here. This is a lot of melanocytes for the epidermis. So I would say that this person, not knowing who it came from, is probably very dark skinned, probably African American, and they have lots of melanocytes, making their skin appear very dark. Now, it frustrates the heck out of me because we're so hung up on this planet, in our country, especially with race. And when it comes down to what actually makes skin color look different, it's just this cell right here. Oops, sorry guys. It's literally the only real difference between me and somebody with super dark skin are the number of these melanocytes and the pigment that they produce in the epidermis. That's it. Whether you come from Africa, Siberia, Antarctica, North America, South America, that will determine how many melanocytes are in your epidermis. And here's why. Melanocytes create a pigment that is a natural sunscreen. The sun produces ultraviolet light. And so when you go outside, if you stand out in the sun for 45 minutes, you'll have a burn. And that burn is from the ultraviolet light that the sun is hitting you with? Well, the epidermis is vulnerable to ultraviolet light like every other living material is, and it burns. But as a response, people who lived in areas that have lots of sunlight, like near the equator, they evolved more melanocytes to produce more pigment, to produce more sunscreen. So that these individuals evolved a natural sunscreen, basically. They don't have to put sunscreen on to protect them from getting burned. So in areas where there's a lot of sun throughout the year and throughout the day, those individuals tend to have darker skin because they have more melanin, more melanocytes. If you happen to descend from an area where there's less sunlight, like let's say up here in Canada or up here in Russia, you have lighter skin because you have less need for that sunblock. And that's it. That's this whole difference, mystery between the races. It literally comes down to sunblock. And unfortunately, people have associated, social hierarchies to race. People have associated differences in cultures as also differences in races. And it drives me nuts because as a scientist, as a biologist, and as a human anatomist, I know that the only difference between races is really just this pigment melanin. And so let's talk about it. Sources of skin color are the melanocytes. Okay, thank you, Ivan. Sorry you're dealing with that stuff still. Now, the melanocytes are found in the epidermis. So this is the epidermis right here. The melanocytes are all here. This individual, like I said, would have very dark skin. And they're found in the lower layer of the epidermis, the stratum germinativum. And so as we make new skin cells, we also sometimes make new melanocytes too. And that determines the darkness of our skin. What I mean is this. I have light skin. I have less melanocytes than somebody who has darker skin. But if I go out in the sun and I let myself absorb some ultraviolet light, I burn my epidermis, not dangerously, but just enough that my body then responds by creating darker skin. We call that a tan, right? It's creating more melanocytes to protect me from getting a burn in the future. Now, in 2 weeks' time, that tan is going to be gone if I don't go out and absorb more ultraviolet light. Because if there's no more burning happening, then the body will stop making those darker melanocytes and my skin will go back to its lighter complexion. But if it's in the summer and I happen to be outside a lot, my skin's going to get darker because I need more natural sunblock. And this natural sunblock comes from this material called melanin. And it's a chemical, it's a protein actually, a protein that looks brown, yellowish brown, or black. And it depends on your genetics. Some of us have melanin that looks very brown, some of us have melanin that looks yellow-brown, some of us have melanin that looks black. Some of us have a mixture of those three different pigments. And that creates the differences in all these different skin tones we see on our planet. And the beauty of melanin is that it provides a natural protection from ultraviolet light. It provides natural sunblock for us. It's not bad to go tanning outside. It's the amount of ultraviolet light that you're absorbing that can be a problem. That ultraviolet light damages your skin. And we'll talk a little bit more about what kind of damage it does. But when you get sun, when you get a burn, when you're trying to tan, you're actually burning your epidermis. And as long as the burn isn't so severe that it goes down into the dermis, which some of it will, as long as it's all just a minor sunburn, then it doesn't really do any long-term damage. It's when you're out in the sun constantly that the ultraviolet light then starts to damage the epidermis, getting into the dermis, which can cause problems. And also, every time you go outside and you absorb ultraviolet radiation, ultraviolet light, it can possibly mutate some of your skin cells, which can lead to skin cancer. So the more you go outside to absorb ultraviolet light, the more of a chance that you could get skin cancer in the future. And that's why they say to wear sunscreen when you go outside, because you're limiting the amount of ultraviolet light that's hitting you. Yes, Ramir, so it can give you cancer, exactly. But it's all about quantity. So if you go outside 10 or 15 minutes a day, the chances of you getting skin cancer from that ultraviolet light is very small. If you're outside all the time and you're not putting sunscreen on, and you're constantly burning, you're constantly tanning, then now your chances of getting skin cancer are much, much higher. Your chances are much better that you could. Doesn't mean you will, but the chances are much higher. So the sunscreen provides a chemical protection from ultraviolet light. Your melanin that you naturally have in your skin provides your natural protection, but it's not perfect. Even somebody that has really dark skin, like a black person, they can still get skin cancer. They can still get burned. It's much harder for them to, but they can still get damage from ultraviolet light. Now, there are individuals that don't have any melanin in their skin because their melanocytes either don't produce melanin or just aren't there. They don't have any melanocytes. And we call these individuals albinos. We use the term albino to refer to any living thing that doesn't have any natural color of its own. And I'm not talking about somebody who just looks transparent. An albino does not look transparent. An albino looks more like that. This is what skin looks like without any coloring, without any melanin. And it can happen to families that have very dark skin. These are all brothers and sisters from the same parents. This child is an albino, doesn't produce any melanin. You can see the difference in the complexions. Now, this could create a problem if you lived in an area where there was a lot of sunlight, because this individual doesn't have the natural sunscreen that her brothers and sisters have. And so this person would have to be careful outside. They'd have to put sunblock on all the time. Their skin would age faster because that melanin slows the aging process in our skin from ultraviolet light. Ultraviolet light also ages our skin. Yeah, they you see them in every culture. And so let's finish that slide. I'll come back to that image. We'll talk about freckles when we come back. But make sure you have this note. This is where we're going to stop. And we'll pick up on our coloring conversation next week.